From Finland to Iceland, Scandinavian societies have proven themselves to be trailblazers on the frontier of gender equality for Western society. According to the World Economic Forum, Iceland landed first in the Global Gender Gap Index 2022, meaning that it had the smallest gender pay gap in the world. Iceland was closely followed by Finland and Norway in second and third places, as well as Sweden in fifth. In 2022, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or the OECD, stated that about 3 in 4, or roughly 75% of women, were a part of the paid labor force, while in America, a country generally considered to be progressive on the front of gender equality, the women's labor participation rate is only 58.4%. America doesn't even make the top 10 on the Gender Pay Gap Index. While some suggest that the policies in Nordic countries have room for improvement, there is little doubt that they are still ahead of the rest of the world. But how did they get here? What frontiers did Scandinavians cross to change history forever? And why is it the Scandinavians and not others who are on this frontier?
To answer this question, you need to do more than scan through articles and videos. You need to look at the evidence that has been dug up by archaeologists and the harsh, cold climates of the north.
In 834 CE, an ornately built long ship was lowered into the ground in Oseberg, Norway. On it were the bodies of 2 women. One was about 50 years old and the other was 70 to 80. Around them were artifacts of great value, an ornate bed, a wagon, 4 sledges, among other expensive and sometimes practical things. The way in which these women were buried proved that they were prominent. Whether they were inheritors of power or religious or political leaders, we don't know for sure. However, it is clear that wealth was accumulated during this time and that women shared some of it. What role could women have played to achieve this prosperity? Did men give women this wealth, or did women seize it on their own?
According to Joanna Friedrichsdotter in her book Valkyrie, Viking women were bold and resourceful, determined to use their assets and skills to improve their material conditions, social status, and political influence. Here, Friedrichsdotter suggests that Scandinavian women had many opportunities to contribute to society outside of the household. In the 8th century CE, overpopulation drove many to start fighting each other for land due to its valuable resources. At the start of the Viking Age in the 8th century, fighting men started to leave their small towns in Norway, Sweden, and Denmark in the summers when the seas were less choppy, and started raiding in places much further away. While Viking men crossed geographical frontiers raiding, Scandinavian women back at home were left with the responsibility of managing the everyday necessities. Consequently, these women became pioneers of their time, obtaining political power and responsibility of entire towns, whilst the raiding men were gone during the fighting season. As men left on these raids, women assumed traditionally male roles. However, small amounts of political power were not the whole extent of women's pioneering. Norse women went further to push towards equality by using other tactics as well.
During the Viking Age, from around 793 to 1066 CE, Scandinavian groups pillaged from regions ranging from Scandinavia to the British Isles, Iceland, Greenland, Rus, further south in Europe, and northern parts of the Middle East. Through scientific analysis of teeth from skeletons in northern structures, archaeologists have found that women in fact accompanied warriors along their journeys around the European continent. In addition to this tooth analysis, archaeologists discovered the skeletons of 2 women buried in Denmark who had arrived from somewhere remote. Evidence uncovered to date suggests that most women who traveled with men took care of camps and daily necessities along their journeys. However, in some instances, women left villages on their own in pursuit of a better life. These women, unlike others, did not leave in the footsteps of men, but were blazing their own trails. When archaeologists highlighted signs of a more egalitarian society in Scandinavia, they cited the sagas, which were pieces of literature from the Viking Age. One particular story in the Laxdæla saga stood out especially, by showing a woman who led an expedition. The authors of this saga told of a woman named Un the Deep-Minded, who, after the death of her son Thorstein, led a voyage from the British Isles to Iceland and became one of the first settlers. After arriving in Iceland, she also claimed much of the western island for herself and her family. The fact that Un's story of pioneership was accepted implied that Scandinavian society had also crossed a clear frontier that accepted women in leadership roles. Still, it is often hard to tell whether the sagas are fact or myth. This story leaves historians wondering if there was ever a new trend in female leadership, or if Un was an isolated example. But are there more stories about women who got power in a different way? In 1878, archaeologists came across a warrior Viking grave in Birka, Sweden, assuming that the body inside the grave belonged to a man because it lay next to a sword blade, an axe, and was buried next to the bodies of two horses. However, osteological analysis and a 2017 DNA study showed that the skeleton was in fact female. Osteological and DNA analysis technology is relatively recent, which means that there is a good chance that other skeletons previously thought to have belonged to a male individual were actually female. The technology needed for osteological analysis and DNA studies is relatively recent, and we have yet to find out whether other Scandinavian bodies previously thought to have belonged to male individuals actually belonged to female ones. Still, just because the deceased is female does not necessarily mean that the person identified as a woman. Fascinatingly, there are multiple accounts of Viking females who fought while taking on masculine pronouns. Even 1,000 years ago, biological sex was already acknowledged to not have been inherently gender defining. This shows that although women may have been able to assume traditionally male roles, there's a chance that many female people felt that in order to achieve success in the Norse world, they had to become men. This limits the value of sex identification in skeletons. But many historians believe that there was not enough proof that this person was a warrior. Additionally, even if the skeleton had been a woman who died fighting in battle, this would be only one instance of a woman fighting, and therefore not enough evidence to prove that the entirety of Viking society crossed a gender equality frontier in their raids. But while there are few pieces of archaeological evidence suggesting that many women fought in battle, the sagas affirm that communities at the very least enjoyed telling stories of a world in which women fought. In his book Gesta Danorum, or The Deeds of the Danes, a 12th to 13th century historian named Saxo Grammaticus described a fierce warrior named Lagertha, who fought courageously among other men and women. Grammaticus claimed that Lagertha lived around the 9th century, which leads skeptics today to say that Lagertha was not a real person, because there is no overlap between the time when she and Saxo Grammaticus were supposedly alive. Still, even if Lagertha was not a real fighter, she could very well have been a character who was created to represent other fighting women at the time. Another more specific account of fighting women in Viking armies was recorded later in history by Joannes Skylitzes, a historian in the Byzantine era. Skylitzes wrote about women who fought alongside men in a Varangian army against the Bulgarians in 971 CE. Still, Skylitzes recorded this in the 11th century, a whole lifetime after the battle. It is often hard to distinguish fact from falsehood in stories written long after the events that took place. Nonetheless, these are just two out of many accounts of Norse women fighting in battle, and with the more advanced technology we have today in the archaeological field, we may have yet to discover more fighting women beneath the soil. Scandinavian society adapted closer to the Christian tradition of female subservience, narrowing the possibilities for female power. In the 19th century, the idea of nationhood swept through Europe as countries searched for the qualities that made them unique. Scandinavian countries harnessed the idea of equal treatment of women, referring to their Viking blood. In the early 20th century, Norse countries went even further. Norway gave women the right to vote in 1898. They were followed by Finland in 1906. Icelandic and Danish women won this right in 1915, with Icelandic women obtaining the right just 12 years after all men got it. In 1980, Vigdis Finnbogadottir was elected as not just the first president to be a woman in Iceland, but also in the entirety of Europe. Vigdis ended up being so popular that she held the presidential office for a whole 16 years. Despite controversy, there is substantial evidence that Scandinavian women were pioneers of their equality as they obtained political power, explored new lands independently, participated in the raiding efforts, and perhaps even led their own efforts to settle foreign places. Because of these efforts to assume previously male-dominated roles, Norse society was changed forever. Today, Norse countries also dominate the rest of the world on the World Happiness Report, claiming the top 8 out of 146 spots. This could quite possibly be a result of a more egalitarian society put in place over 1,000 years ago. But if one thing's for sure, it's that today, Scandinavian societies are defining the frontier on a global scale when it comes to policies supporting women who work, and it's our turn as Americans to follow their lead.